right. So we're going to get started. Good evening, everybody. Good to see you all here. Hello. Okay. So very good to see you here. It's been a little while, but I'm glad that you're all still warm and ready to come for these R&D salons. We're at number 7, and this one is going to be devoted to the big theme of museums as citizens. Just for those of you that are here for the first time, the MoMA R&D Salons are an initiative that is part of the Research and Development Initiative that MoMA launched about a year and a half ago. Amongst the various agendas, there are many that are overt and some others that are hidden agendas of the R&D department, is that of trying to really strengthen the connection between museums and the real world, museums and reality. It's a very simple question that we ask ourselves. Says who that we should exist forever? And we did not exist forever in the past. And in order to exist in the future, it's not enough to just show, to just educate. It's not enough to just collect. We also need to establish a connection with reality that is more tight and that is more metabolistic in a way. So the R&D salons work on topics that are relevant to the museum, of course, but also to the world at large. And what could be more relevant than the theme of museums as citizens? It's a theme that is as wide as an ocean, and that's why the presentation that I'll make tonight, that should be 7 minutes, I hope not to go too much over, is really just a brush with the topic. And it's a presentation that actually was put together by Aline Rezende, the R&D research assistant, that I would have never been able to do otherwise, to make otherwise, because it's really very strong with a history of the relationship between museums and society. But of course, when we talk about museums and citizens, the first thing that we have to explore is the notion of citizenship. And it has to do, of course, with power, with agency, with politics, with being involved in our own life. And, it's going to be impossible to talk about all the different aspects, but, there's politics as emergency, politics as urgency, and then politics as normalcy. Tonight we'll talk about both, but mostly about emergency in many cases. An example, there are various ways for museums to be engaged in events that happen, that are really revolutions and that are really important for history. One example is what happened in 2011 in Egypt and during the Arab Spring. In that particular case, the museum in Cairo was not at all involved in the revolution. Actually, it was open to the public, but it was actually safeguarded by security militia from the army. The problem is that the director of the museum lamented the fact that besides losing a few artifacts because there was a little bit of looting, the real problem in his eyes and in his mind was that it cut off all of its blood lifeline because no tourists were going anymore and nobody was going into the museum anymore. So in that particular case, disconnection and a sense of alienation and really removed removed relationship between the museum and the people. Turkey, May-August 2013. In that particular case, the museums were so connected to the government that they remained completely detached once again from the action. And it was instead smaller galleries that catalyzed the whole will and the whole energy of artists. For instance, with the Free Gazi exhibition, there was a Galatea art, or with the Aesthetics of Resistance exhibition at the Gallery Park Art. But in that case, galleries and artists organized by themselves, and the museums, once again, remained detached from everything else. Brazil, June 2013, even in this case, the museums remained, for the most part, disconnected from the protest, and it was instead a group of professional photographers that were working to make it known to the whole Brazil that this kind of protest was going on. So in this case, really the artists act by themselves without much support from the museum world. what does it mean to be a good citizen? And why were these museums not involved in being citizens? Of course, when we talk about citizenship, we have to go back first and foremost to Aristotle. That was one of the first philosophers that theorized the idea of citizenship for all of us to understand. And one of the most important principles that he developed was the idea that the individual citizen's happiness coincided with the state's happiness. So there was this communal goal of making everything better that gave agency to the citizen, him or herself. And also, there was the idea that for a state to happen, there needed to be a critical mass of people that made citizens, and that therefore had to be involved in the government of the city itself, citizen city. It was about, at that time, city-state. But it was really interesting because in Athens, at least, citizens were also very involved in the government. There were no representative elected. They were involved directly. In Rome, citizenship became a privilege. You know, because the empire was so vast, in order to participate and to really have the right, not really the responsibility, but more the right to vote, you had to become part of the citizenry. So citizenship as privilege is something that developed at that time. And we see that rights and responsibilities are really the essence of what it means to be a citizen from that moment on. We jump to Thomas Jefferson. And of course, many of you that are American know this quotation. And of course, instead, people like me that are not American have to learn it to become citizens. So I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. The idea of education that is so fundamental to museums and sometimes also so misleading is at the core of this particular quotation and at the core of the idea of agency between institutions and citizens. And I was telling you, this is what happens when you want to become a citizen of the United States, which I haven't done yet, but I'll get there. By the way, can I say it? Today is my 20th anniversary of arriving in New York. Yay! So, yeah, thank you, today. So see, citizenship, rights, and responsibility. And the rights are beautiful. They're all freedoms. Freedom to express yourself, freedom to worship, right to a prompt, fair trial, and so on and so forth. And then you have responsibilities. And on the one hand, the rights are about freedom. The responsibilities are mostly about respect, which is so beautiful. You know, if you think about it, that's what it's all about, freedom and respect. And every day we wake up and we can be amazed that the balance between these two is still making sure that not everything blows up. You know, it's a very fine balance and a beautiful one at that. Aline put together this amazing timeline that shows how museums opened up to society. And you know, you can tattoo it on your arm and then read it every day. But I'm going to go through it very, very quickly. From an aristocratic idea of showing off to your friends, the cabinets of curiosity, or opening up your private collection as an aristocrat for a few friends, we go into the French Revolution and the Enlightenment age. So in the first museum revolution happened after the French Revolution. So the Louvre opened, I think it was 1793 that it opened. Yeah, 1793. So right after the French Revolution. And the idea was to make all these collections available for the public to see. And then we get to the Victoria and Albert, which is about little less than a century later, the year after the Great Exhibition in London. And at that point, it's not only to show and to make available, but also to educate the masses. So the whole idea was to become an educational institution. And at that time, in the 19th century, during the second half of the century, there was a museum boom all over Europe. So all major cities started opening up these palaces and making them into museums for the education and the uplift of the masses. In a way, the V&A, the Victoria and Albert in London, had the mandate that was the most educational because also it was connected to the opening of the Science Museum in London at the same time. 20th century, the first half is still about national pride, romantic nationalism, and propaganda for all the autocratic regimes that happened in Europe. We'll get to that afterwards. And it's only after the half of the century that museums change and become instead much more about social improvement. And we'll see that. Well, so we were talking about early 20th century, an era of great political instability, revolutions, and very often, museums are connected to institutions and to governments, and therefore they suffer directly both of the good and bad moments of government history. So in the early 20th century, a lot of propaganda and nationalism, and many museums were supposed to actually further that propaganda and distribute good values in society, while the politically subversive discourse was left to cafes, to cabarets, to schools like the Bauhaus, to independent entities. Museums were detached from that kind of social progress, to the point that the connection between museums, institutional art, and propaganda that happened during the Nazi era was really very overt when there was the Degenerate Art Exhibition, which was held in Munich in the Archaeology Museum in the Hofgarten. So it was a museum that was chosen because it was so dark and chaotic in the way it was configured. So the architecture and the museum institution was chosen to make a point that was absolutely going in the reverse direction with social progress. We jumped to what was happening at the same time on the other side of the world, and in particular here at MoMA. I have to say that I didn't know enough about Catherine Bauer, but she was an extremely important figure. She worked on the 1932 International Architecture Exhibition with Philip Johnson and Hitchcock. And then she became a big proponent of housing for the middle and lower classes in the United States. There was a beautiful exhibition in 1934 called America Can't Have Housing, and then Architecture and Government Housing in 1936. She also stayed on at MoMA and participated in several other programs that always were about connecting what the museum could do for the world and for citizens. She was also part of the jury for the prize Design for Modern Furniture, which was won by Charles and Ray Eames. And you can see her sitting there with Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and with Edgar Kaufmann that looks on. And they are choosing the furniture for the new middle class. Remember all the GIs that were coming back from the war with a little money from the GI Bill? They needed a new way of living, and that's what Catherine was working on with Mies van der Rohe. Let's put things in perspective. Beautiful initiative that was almost the beginning of art therapy is the War Veterans Art Center that was here at MoMA in 1942, in which veterans were brought in to be uplifted with the arts. We're still dealing with a very literal use of art to improve social conditions, but still it's something that we must not discount. And there are so many ways for the museum to be involved and to mediate the idea of art with society. There was also an Art for War Veterans exhibition in 1945. Exhibition X is very interesting from a political standpoint. It was an exhibition that was meant to stimulate and push the involvement of the United States in the Second World War. It was an absolute propaganda exhibition that created quite a stir here at MoMA. It was concocted by Leslie Cheek Jr. together with the executive committee of MoMA, but without the trustees of MoMA knowing about it. So there was a beautiful article that Michelle Elligot from the director of our archives wrote about this particular exhibition. She found all the different artifacts. But in the end, there's a letter from Abby Aldrich, a really lovely letter, in which she says, you know what, this would be a movie more than an exhibition. How many times have I heard that when they reject one of my shows? So, we were talking about political involvement. Sometimes political involvement is very subtle. It's just about suggesting a new way of living. So you've seen war, you've seen big ideas, but it was also important to see how the museum was trying to educate retailers and wholesale retailers to give the masses better products. And in particular with this Good Design series of exhibitions in the 1950s, in which curators from MoMA were just going around to various stores with people from the Merchandise Mart and giving good objects, this little brand, this little mark that was called Good Design, that was orange, white, and black. So it was a way to stimulate quality also amongst pots and pans, and why not? Jumping to the Second World War and to how museums and art were used, or actually were used, we can say used, to stimulate an idea, a civic sense. I want to show you these pictures from Milan, where in Palazzo Reale, which is a place where now there's the Museo del Novecento, one painter, Attilio Rossi, called on his friend Picasso to lend Guernica so that it could be installed in the Sala delle Cariatidi, which is a very beautiful room that was bombed and was therefore in ruins. Guernica, as you probably know, was painted by Picasso, I think just the year after the Basque city was destroyed, and it had become an emblem of anti-fascism. So it was very important to have it in Milan after the war, when the relationship with the United States and the relationship with the Allies before was still kind of fraught with so many different baggages. I'm speaking too much. So you see here what I'm talking about. You know, museums become spaces where you can make a point that is about civic sense. The turning point was for everything 1968, of course, and we know what happened in 1968. I don't have to tell you this, but what happened is that art had also a big turn, and it became arts for the people. I'm not saying that it was so automatic, but almost. And there was a second museum revolution that opened up museum, and in particular, the most symbolic museum of all is the Centre Pompidou, which opened in 1977, but was conceived after 1968, and it was supposed to be a reaction to 1968. It was about overture, also from an architectural viewpoint. Civil rights movement changed everybody's life, and throughout Europe things were happening. In Milan in 1968, the Triennale, which is an architectural show that was happening every 3 years, was devoted to the idea of the big number, of mass. But it couldn't even open because it was occupied right away by students and demonstrators. And there was a lot of alternative exhibitions that were presented at the same time. In 1969, in Rio de Janeiro, Federico de Moraes, in a very, very subtle way, responded to the dictatorship, the military dictatorship, by having these Sundays in which, creative Sundays they were called, in which people could go and make art. And that was the subversive way to give people a sense of pride and agency through art. So we see all these different ways throughout the world to react to different difficult circumstances by means of art and by means of using museums thoughtfully. New museology is a big shift. I know sometimes I show a similar slide for design, which is like old design and new design, and it's so amazingly different that it changes the way you look at the world, and the same with new museology. It's from preservation of objects and thinking of objects to preservation to pushing new ways of living and working in the interest of society. Yeah, I'm going to pause for a second if you want to take a picture of this slide, because it's really a good one. But we could have 5 or 6 symposia, 2-day symposia on this. I was telling you about the Centre Pompidou. In a way, really, the Centre Pompidou and the work of Harold Zeman, there are several like milestones of this change that are really important. But after that, we were never the same. And participation also became more and more a rooted idea, even though I understand from Aline, because I didn't know it, that it really exploded only after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the sense that it existed before, but it became codified only after that. And of course, we're at the point today of talking about sociomuseology and really acknowledging that art is for social change. Of course, I had to put my little thing to break my little spell for design. Design has always been for social change, duh. But, you know, some important milestones in the way museums have spread awareness of big issues in society. This is the Black Male Show, and there are only a few. I mean, we could have so many of these examples, but I also know that my colleagues will talk about them. The Black Male Show, Representations of Masculinity in Contemporary American Art, Thelma Golden at the Whitney in 94, 95. General Idea and AIDS awareness at MoMA in 96, 97. the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, awareness of gay rights, gay rights, the ones that are closer to us, not the ones from 20 years ago, so marriage parity, or even the awareness of what went on in New Orleans. It was so difficult for some of us to go beyond the news and understand really what was going on. And art is a way to make people aware. I was talking about normalcy and not only emergency. I have to say that Rising Currents was one example of an exhibition at MoMA that talks about possible future and normalcy and tries to influence policy and influence architecture and urban planning before things happen. Or the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which is the theoretical arm of a dispersed museum of land and tries to explain the way land is used to citizens. So in this case, it's explanation, not even education, just awareness. Lately, we've seen also many more efforts happening by big museums. Big museums are sometimes like big pachyderms. They take a little while before they follow in the footsteps of, for instance, Creative Time. So the Brooklyn Museum has an amazing feminist center. At MoMA, we have a big effort that's funded and that's really stimulated by one trustee, but that has become almost like an avalanche and has produced an amazing book last year, Modern Women, and also several exhibitions. You might want to go see Juliet Kinchin's, my colleague Juliet's exhibition about modern women and design. And also, this idea of art for social change has been embraced by outside of the art world by big conferences. Last year at the Aspen Ideas Festival, Anna de Veer-Smith had thought of a whole stream of the festival that was about the citizen artist, and she had Yo-Yo Ma and Perry Chen and Theaster Gates speaking. Or this year, Shirin Neshat was given the Crystal Awards at the World Economic Forum, and she made an amazing speech, and President Rouhani was there, so she could talk to him directly, and she told him to take care of his artists. And actually, the whole speech, if you want to watch it, is on Creative Time Reports. That is the website of that is all made by artists that are also activists. So you see, it used to be the museum, and I'm sorry if I'm still using a box. It's not a box anymore, but the museum giving education to citizens. Then it was citizens teaching the museum what to do. And now it's this kind of explosion. It has to be a chain reaction. It has to be going all ways, not even two ways, all ways. And it's what we're looking for. So questions for tonight, there are so many. In which areas of the world is the museum a benevolent institution? Can museums ignite a productive and dynamic economy? You name it. There are so many possibilities. But what is important is to think that museums are deeply embedded in society. And museums are almost individuals with agency, with responsibilities, and with rights. And to speak about that tonight, we have a fabulous, fabulous panel. I'm gonna talk about them just in order of apparition, of appearance. It's gonna be first Tom Finkelpearl, who's this guy over here. He's the director of the Queen's Museum that is not anymore the Queen's Art Museum. It's only the Queen's Museum, and he'll explain why. Then a second will go David van der Leer, who's like the fashion model over there. And David is now the director of the Van Allen Institute. That is an institute that is involved in urban planning, but also in pushing policies and creating competitions and making things happen. And before that, he was at the Guggenheim, where he conceived and ran the Guggenheim labs that were all over the world. Then we're going to have Holly Block with the pink lipstick. She's the director of the Bronx Museum of Art, and she really knows what it means to be embedded in a community and having a continuous direct contact with the community. And last week, she had a beautiful panel at her museum that was about small institutions and the impact that they can have. And last but not least, the fab Ann Pasternak, who's the director of Creative Time. How can I call Creative Time? Creative Time is not an institution, it's not a museum, of course, but it's one of the most capillary and pervasive art initiatives in New York, and it has been for quite a long time. So I would like to call to the non-podium Tom Finkelpearl first. Thank you.